Hello everyone, welcome back. Thank you for coming here and being with me. For those of you who might be new, we have new people every week. We use headphones. There will be a soundtrack at the end that we listen to, and there will be a free download of that soundtrack. And you can get this download from this address right here. scientificsounds.com, Quantum Brain Mind 2. Here you can go to ask a question or make comments about anything to do with these live streams. scientificsounds.com/ask-a-question. And here is the address for seeing any of the live streams I've done up to this point. And if you are new, it's my recommendation to go back and watch them from the beginning, because each one builds on the one before. And today is no exception. I'll be making reference to some of the things I've covered in great detail in previous live streams. So I'll mention it and at a surface level without getting into all the details of it. But you can see those details in previous live streams. Yesterday I just finished my day-long workshop. I'm now giving a series of these workshops on various things. Yesterday was all the soundtracks that I've produced, generic soundtracks that are on my website. They're basically all designed to play your body as well as your mind through the sound table and the sound chair that I've designed and have patents on. They're designed a certain way and a certain configuration to match the soundtracks. You would know that they're designed to play your body unless you had a sound table or a sound chair experience to feel it happening in your body the same way it's happening here. And so that workshop is about how to use those soundtracks with the sound table, how to build a business doing that, how to use it at home for healing or meditation. A month from now, I have another one that'll be on brainwaves, brain entrainment, and then the next month after that, in August, will be one on physical healing with sound waves. It's a day-long workshop. Go to the website, scientificsounds.com, and look at the tab at the top that says webinars, and you can see that. Meantime, our last discussion was about quantum brain, quantum mind. And the deeper we dig into this, and there's a slew of now research coming out. My news feeds are full every week with something new about the quantum characteristics of the mind, or the quantum characteristics of brain processes. As we talked last time, the brain processes, quantum brain processes, tend to really start to center into new discoveries about the synapse, where you have a neuron, a brain cell, with all these axons coming out, wire connections coming out. And those wire connections connect to the wires of other neurons. So one neuron will attach to many, 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 many other neurons. And those neurons all attach to many, many neurons. And there is something like an order of more than 1 trillion connections of where axons, it's a brain network. And as we've seen, the more neuron connections between neurons, the better the brain works. And IQ seems to be directly connected with how many connections we have between neurons. It's not so much having more brain cells, it's having more connections between brain cells that makes the difference. So, for instance, Einstein's brain had, 35% more connections. It was 35% denser and heavier than normal brain because of the nerve connections, the brain connections between the neurons. And at every connection point of all of those axons, every single one of them, thousands and thousands and thousands of axons, connecting to thousands and thousands of other axons, trillions of axons all connected together at these junction points. The junction point, the synapse between where one axon ends and another one begins from another neuron, there's a space there. And neurotransmitters, neurochemical hormones, pass across that gap. So it becomes electrical down the axon. When it gets to the synapse, it becomes chemical. And there's a variety of which chemicals are going to pass across. So not only is there an electrical thing going down the axon, but it has a quality as well as a quantity of electricity. There's qualities of electricity which are going to choose which of these neurotransmitters is going to be the one that goes across the gap. And depending on which one goes across the gap, it's going to color the type of transmission that continues to the other neuron with that neuron. It's immensely complex. But these neurochemical hormones and how they pass seems to be a quantum process. There's a quantum process involved in how that transmission takes place. And it appears to be synchronized up with other axon connections, with other neurons throughout the system. And part of that is how we end up with synchronized firing of various neurons at the same time. And those synchronized firings are all based on a rule in physics, a law in physics, the law of coupled oscillators, which I spent a lot of time talking about before. The physics of the law of coupled oscillators means that everything in the universe is trying to time itself to everything else. So everybody's trying to dance to a drum beat that's already beating in order to save energy. It saves energy for me to dance to a drum beat that's already happening than for me to invent a drum beat moment by moment by moment to dance to, because it takes energy to invent a drum beat. And every second I've got to invent a new drum beat. That takes a lot of energy. So if somebody else is already doing it, then I will just save my energy and dance to the drum beat that's already happening. So in essence, everything in the universe is dancing to a drum beat that's already happening, but nobody's beating the drum except everyone by consensus, moment by moment. We're all listening to each other, but nobody's actually leading. In nature, there are stronger influences than others, and the system always reverts to the strongest influence in the environment. So if there are a series of rhythms and drum beats in the environment, my body will always gravitate towards the most dominant one. Again, by using the path of least resistance. Instead of my system sitting back and going, which one should I choose? That's taking energy. If I have to make a decision about which one I want to choose, so if I have a rule that says whoever's the most dominant one, that's the one I'll choose. So I won't even have to think about it. Whoever's most dominant, I choose that one. So first of all, I look around in the environment to find out which drum beat to time myself to save energy. And of all the ones in the environment, I'm going to choose the most dominant one. That's the reason why brain entrainment works. Because when I expose you to a sound pulse that's pulsing at a brainwave speed, I want to make sure that it's the most dominant pulse in the environment. And if I'm doing it through speakers and it's louder than anything else, that's the one I default to. If it's in headphones, then everything else is blocked out and I have your control. I have your dominant pulse. Change gears and start in training itself to the pulse that I'm providing. And if the pulse that I'm providing is a brainwave speed, your brainwaves, which drive the whole system, right? My body clocks are in my brain. The center of it is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a little organelle inside the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus houses a bunch of different little organelles, and some of those are the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system that drives the whole system, tells everything what to do, and monitors everything. So the brain exhibits the finest degree of expression of this coupled oscillator phenomenon because it's the most number one responsive of anything in my system, and it controls the system. So everybody kind of defaults to time themselves to the master clock. So the master clock will, through coupled oscillator networks, time a hierarchy of clocks in the system. And then those clocks will time clocks that stand under them, and those will time clocks that stand under them. And so this network of clocks within clocks within clocks all synchronize themselves up together in a hierarchy of clocks, all subservient to the master clock of the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the center of the brain, in the hypothalamus. Hardwired, by the way, to the pineal gland, which in esoteric literature is associated with the crown chakra and associated with the grand awakening of consciousness, of self-awareness and awareness of the cosmos, cosmic consciousness. All of this sort of hangs together after a while, as we'll start to see in some of these live streams and in today in particular. So the more we get into this, more we realize. So when I went to school, and we were learning cellular biology, in those days the cell is a little membrane filled with intracellular fluid floating in a sea of extracellular fluid. So there's this little membrane that separates out the intracellular fluid, and inside of that are all these little organelles floating around. The nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria and stuff like that. They've all got fancy schmancy names, and they all have different duties to do, but they're just kind of floating around in the water in there. And in the last 20 years, it's become more and more evident that that's not the case at all. And the cells aren't just kind of floating around either in this extracellular fluid. And the organelles inside the cell are not just floating around in water. There's a scaffolding, there's a microskeletal structure in the body at a cell level and below. So inside the cell, all those organelles are tied together with other organelles with something called microtubules. And microtubules are sort of a intracellular skeletal structure, a scaffolding of these microtubules that are made of microcrystalline substances which have piezoelectric properties. And the piezo, if I take a bone cell, an osteoblast, and I torque the cell, I bend it. So once I get up and stand up, gravity subtly bends my long bones with gravity, and the bone cells bend as well. So the cell itself begins to torque from gravity, and when that torquing causes the piezoelectric effect to fire and depolarizes the cells on the outside of the bone cell to the opposite field, a negative field, and that attracts positive calcium ions. But the flexing itself generates electrical pulses. Electricity arises from the distorting of the shape of the membrane. An electrical pulse arises from mechanical distortion of the shape of the cell membrane. And now we're seeing the reason for that is because the cell membrane has multiple thousands of these microtubules attached to the inside of the cell membrane, attached to the organelles inside, and a massive scaffolding of these microtubules that have piezoelectric properties. So now when you distort the shell, you're actually torquing the microtubules and generating electrical pulses from them. And so the electrical pulses generate out into the body, and they go into places where the paths of least resistance exist, like acupuncture meridians, any kind of system that uses electricity, the chakras, the nadis, the electrical subtle lines of force that connect the chakras to subtle energy fields that surround my body, which are generated as biomagnetic fields from nerve firings through all my brain processes, and my traveling down my nerves generate biomagnetic fields. Blood going through my arteries and veins, iron filings that have magnetic properties in motion generate electrical fields. Those interact with the magnetic fields from other systems. The chakras and the nadis are electromagnetic. The meridians are electromagnetic. All of these things are generating magnetic fields, and all of them intertwining with each other and supporting each other. And when a sound wave hits your body, if I speak to you, I'm shooting sound waves out in a certain packet of shape because I'm shaping it with my mouth. Those packets of sound waves strike your body, and some of them go inside your ears so you can hear, but the rest of them hit your body. And when they hit your body, it causes a sort of a distortion, a impression on your body of the force of the sound wave, presses your body, distorts the cells, and generates electrical pulses from all your cells from the piezoelectric effect of the microtubules that depolarizes an electrical wave that passes through your body, which is the shape of the sound wave converted to electricity. And one cell electrical depolarization causes the next cell to depolarize and the next cell to depolarize. And now we have a wave of electromagnetic frequencies passing through your body in the shape of the sound wave. There's power and energy there. It's converted into electricity, the sound waves. And once it's in electricity, it's passing into the system into pathways of least resistance to electrical flow, which is meridians and blood and chakras and a nervous system. All of those things are interacting. So in one sense, sound waves, mechanical energy waves of pure energy moving through a medium, striking your body, is imparting that energy into your body into another form, an electrical form, a form of photons. Electrical interactions generate heat and photons. So all of these electrical depolarizations that are in the shape of the sound waves are also generating photons, scatters of photons, and the photons are rhythmically scattering in the shape of the sound wave as well. So part of the reason why we can measure photons coming off the body, right, as I described at California Institute for Human Science. One of the research projects was to put somebody in a electromagnetically shielded room and 100% dark space, and put a photon counter in there and measure the photons that are issuing from your body per second from the normal processes of life itself at a subatomic level. Those interactions at a subatomic level generate electromagnetic fields, and interactions of electromagnetic fields generate photons, and we can measure those photons coming off your body. 1 photon per second per centimeter squared. Every square centimeter, 1 photon coming off all over my body, except 100 photons to 1,000 photons per second over the 7 chakra areas. So all of a sudden, we've got a scientific method for measuring not the subtle energy field of the chakra, but its effect on physicality through the generation of photons from the increased subtle energy interactions with non-subtle energy fields in my body, which generate photons. So now we can measure the energy level of each chakra by measuring how many photons come off. And once that happens, we can do research. Can I use sound waves, certain sound frequencies, to influence each chakra, influence its function? And we could tell if it's working by counting the photons. If it's weak, if most of the chakras are 750 to 1,000 photons per second coming off, but the heart chakra is 25, then there's something going on there. It's weak. Can we influence it and change that 25 to 700 with a sound wave or a color frequency that's precise, or Reiki, or energy work, or Qigong? This is where funding should be going, but it doesn't go there. It goes to medical systems, drugs and surgeries, and fancy schmancy equipment for hospitals. It doesn't go to this kind of research. We need to fund that ourselves. We need to band together, and we need to come up with our own sources of funding, because it's not going to come from that world. They have no interest in fleshing out what a holistic approach is doing, because it's competition in the marketplace. And there shouldn't be competition in the marketplace for healing or for waking up the population to become more self-aware. But as we were talking last time, the sort of continually deeper levels of mind blow for me that happens as new and new research reports come out that are linking more closely and more closely brain function in the cortex, in the neurons, in the spark gap between neurons, between where the interface between axons meet together, the synapse. It appears that the synapse is closely associated with quantum processes in the brain, which link the brain to other external world processes in the general quantum field in the whole universe and with other life forms. So where we ended last time was the quantum computers in microtubules. Turns out that there's tons of microtubules in the brain. So one way to consider synchronized neurons, the neurons that are firing together in synchronicity, which I'm talking about brain waves here, right? Neurons fire, but they fire in synchronicity with each other in waves of depolarization, and the speed of those waves are directly related to different states of consciousness: beta, alpha, theta, delta, right? So if you have beta brain activity where the sweeps of depolarization of neurons across the cortex is 20 sweeps per second, 20 brain wave sweeps per second, 20 hertz, then I'm out here in the world, focused my attention doing regular stuff in the world. Left brain linear kind of thinking, doing activities, focusing on tasks. But if the depolarization sweeps are 5 times per second instead of 20, different state of consciousness. If I'm sleeping, then I'm dreaming. That's where dreaming happens. If I'm up and around, it's where creativity happens. It's where imagination takes place. It's where emotions are worked on at night in dreaming sleep. It's a shamanic journey in a meditative state. All because there's something that's linking specific states of consciousness and the speed of depolarization of these neurons and the synchronized waves of these depolarizations are controlled, it appears more and more, from interactions at a quantum level in the microtubules which make up the neurons. There's microtubules in the neurons as well. Those are cells, and they have a scaffolding. And the axons that come out are chock full of these microtubules as well. So it appears that the microtubules are a link between this macro world that appears to be running the rules of Newtonian physics And the bridge between Newtonian physics and quantum physics is at the atomic level inside the microtubules, which are just spread throughout the entire system. So one way to consider synchronized neurons involves quantum computers in the microtubules of the neurons. These quantum calculations throughout the brain would be connected by coherence. And coherence means that they're firing together, they're synchronized up, right? Just like we see in the grand universal law of coupled oscillators, coupled oscillator connections, where things want to resonate together and dance to the same drum beat because it saves energy to do so. It's a path of least resistance. These quantum calculations that connect neurons in coherence is because they want to, because it saves energy to do so. This type of microtubule quantum computer would have the unique properties of mind already mentioned, as opposed to a conventional computer, where a conventional computer, the language is zeros and ones. It's on or off, the gate is open or closed. And a quantum computer uses a qubit, which is vast arrays of all possibilities of on, off, 0, 1, 0, 1, and maybe. It's the Schrodinger's cat paradox state of 0 and 1, neither one yet, right? 0, 1 is like the living cat, dead cat. It's the 0 cat or the 1 cat, but it's sort of the coin in a constant state of flipping. It hasn't landed as heads or tails yet. And when it's in that state, all possible calculations can be made simultaneously, parallel to each other, instead of the way a regular computer works, which is each process has to be completed before the next process can be done. It's a linear line. I do this calculation, then I can do this one, then I can do this one. But in a qubit, in a quantum computer, all possible calculations can be done simultaneously with each other and explore every possible answer that could come up simultaneously. So quantum computers can do unimaginable, immense calculations in a few seconds that would take an ordinary computer 250,000 years to accomplish. And that, right there, is what's happening in the brain. The brain being a quantum computer, and every neuron in the brain being its own quantum computer, and all of the quantum computers inside all of the neurons of the brain are populated with these millions and billions of microtubules, and the microtubules that are inside each neuron of the brain are themselves a quantum computer, all networked together in a massive array within a single neuron. And then all the neurons are creating a massive array in the brain. So this begins to give you some kind of a glimpse of just how massive of a quantum computer the brain really is. Way bigger than anybody ever supposed. Its calculation possibilities are almost at a level of infinity. Microtubules are kind of the very small, unique helical shape, which means they're spirals, not just circles. They're spirals going down. Inside this microtubule helix, with a diameter of 25 nanometers, the local environment is determined by the specific amino acids and proteins. And as soon as we're talking about amino acids and proteins, we're talking about DNA. Because as I said before in one of my previous broadcasts, the one of May 9th, which was censored and banned by YouTube because I spent 5 minutes talking about how DNA and RNA and mRNA relate to the current vaccine program. So I won't mention it again because you can only talk in glowing, wonderful terms about that. You can't have an intelligent conversation about any possible problems. So with the as soon as we have a DNA, which is a manufacturing plant for proteins, and the RNA is the library of blueprints of proteins, and the mRNA carries a message from the RNA library that gives a message to the mRNA and says, I want you to carry this message as a courier over to the DNA factory. And in that message it says, I want you to make 250 million of these proteins, and 500 million of these proteins, and 350 million of these proteins, and those proteins, and manufacture those and pop them out the other end. We're going to shuttle them off to various places in the body where tissues need to be rebuilt, and tissues are made of proteins. So for here, as soon as amino acids and proteins are involved, the microtubules and the DNA are intertwined and involved together. For example, the amino acids of phenylalanine and tryptophan both have a ring structure creating a specific quantum effect. In pockets inside the microtubule, where these two amino acids predominate, water will be excluded. There is a specific quantum effect that occurs within water, excluding space. It is this, what's called the London effect, that is proposed to be the basis of the quantum computer in microtubules. Whether the water is there or expressed out, controlled by these proteins, which are produced by the DNA in combination with the microtubule, that becomes the on-off switch, or the 0 or the 1 in the quantum computer. Except in this case, it's not just 0 and 1, it's 0, 1, and maybe, because it's a quantum effect. It's all possible effects at the microtubule level. So with 100 billion neurons, and considering only 1,000 dendrite connections per neuron, dendrite connections are the axons I'm talking about, 1,000 axon connections per neuron which attach to other axon connections from other neurons. That would give our brain a capacity of 10 to the 26th operations per second for a quantum brain computer. Quite a huge capacity, which might be enough for all of a mind's details. Well, that's an understatement, because those 10 to the 26th operations per second is so unimaginably large that, and is all happening simultaneously in parallel corridors of calculations in the qubit, that pretty much every possibility that could ever happen is simultaneously calculated. And then the brain can pick and choose which are the best ones, instead of being hit or miss. So if I can calculate every possible outcome, and then get to choose the best of the mix every second, it's sort of unbelievable. So, you know, the context of these things that are nanometers small, they're so small that they're approaching the borderline between physics and metaphysics, the borderline between Newtonian physics and quantum physics, which I had talked about before. I had a whole live stream on this before, called The Wall, where the wall is the division place, the interface between Newtonian physics, this regular world, and the laws that seem to govern it, and the quantum world, where those laws are thrown out the window and they don't seem to make any sense at all from a Newtonian standpoint. Time flows forward and backward at the same time. Cats are living and dead at the same time. The consciousness is required for reality to exist, and other effects that are equally mind-numbing kind of things. Where those two fields interact, the regular rules here and the rules in the quantum field, the interface is the periodic table, where the smallest particle that could be possibly identified of a material substance is represented as the atoms of the periodic table. So it's an atom of iron, an atom of manganese, an atom of potassium, an atom of carbon, an atom of gold. It's the smallest particle that you could ever identify of gold before it falls apart into its component pieces, which are the same pieces that make up all the atoms of the periodic table and now become indistinguishable from each other. Protons, electrons, neutrons. So the protons, electrons, and neutrons that make up each atom, and in a certain configuration of protons, electrons, and neutrons, which make the atom the smallest particle of matter we can identify. As soon as they come apart out of that pattern, it's just letters in an alphabet. No sentences are being made. And that's the division between matter, which has a pattern, and the pattern being broken into its component parts, which is atoms, which is components of atoms, protons, electrons, and neutrons, and all the little smaller particles that each of those is made from. That represents the quantum field and different rules. But the interface of the atom and its component parts is where the action is. And that action is where things slip back and forth between a metaphysical and a physical back and forth. The chakras represent that par excellence, because the chakras are a physical interface at the one side, where and a metaphysical interface at the other side. So in the metaphysical interface, the chakras are spinning vortexes of energy. And in the physical side, they have a glandular counterpart. Each chakra has a gland associated with it. A postganglionic neural plexus coming from the spinal cord that supplies that gland. So now there's a neurological interface. There's an acupuncture point that ties the acupuncture meridian system into that mix. And all of these things are networked together at an interface between the spinning vortex of energy and my next breath. So as I control muscle groups tied in with meridians, tied in with glands, tied in with the nervous system, as I control that breath, I can control the subtle energy chakra to scrape ever finer degrees of prana off the regular air I'm breathing. And it's a 7-step-up transformer of chakras that pull ever finer degrees of prana from regular air through a control system that I have built into my system that runs on automatic in a meditation process of being able to pull finer and finer degrees of energy, which are the fuel for running higher and higher levels of machinery in my system, until the finest degree of prana, the quote, 5-star jet fuel, as opposed to fusel oil for the first chakra and 5-star jet fuel for the crown chakra, associated with the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is associated with, again, microtubules. And the pineal gland produces melatonin, this hormone, into the cerebrospinal fluid, which only circulates around the brain and spinal cord. All the other glands associated with the other chakras produce their hormones into the bloodstream, but only the pineal gland puts its hormone into the cerebrospinal fluid and charges the brain directly. And melatonin is derived from serotonin, which is one of the neurotransmitters that's used at the synapse between neurons. It's one of the transmitters. And it comes from tryptophan. Tryptophan is used to manufacture serotonin. Serotonin is used to manufacture melatonin. And melatonin is produced by the pineal gland during moments of extreme self-awareness. As we have seen from previous research in the 1960s, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who were psychiatrists. Alpert became Baba Ram Dass, Gunther Weil. I met these people. I worked with Gunther Wild in a Gurdjieff group I was in for years. I did the sound for Timothy Leary because he aligned himself with the California Institute for Human Science when I was there. And in the 60s, they were doing research to find out what kind of physical effects happen from the use of LSD, where ordinary personality just vaporizes, and who's left is Big Mind that runs this body, that designed this body out of 2 cells, that is networked into the universe and has the answers. The ancient part, the wise part of me, I then get in contact with. And the only thing they found was massive levels of melatonin that were produced by the pineal gland. So all of a sudden, that was the first indication that melatonin may have something else to do aside from being part of timing my sleep cycle. It has to do with not only timing my sleep cycle, but it has to do with waking me up in the big sense of the word. So it has to do with waking up, and it has to do with going to sleep. The yin-yang of the pineal gland and melatonin. But the fact that melatonin is based on serotonin, one of the neurotransmitters, which is based on tryptophan, and when we look at this article here, we're talking about phenylalanine and tryptophan being associated with the microtubule complex. So now, once again, things are tying together. The pineal gland is a gland. It's made of cells. Inside the cells are this massive network of microtubules. And all the cells are connected to other cells by an external microtubular skeletal system as well. So all the cells are held in place with the scaffolding of these microcrystalline structure spiraled tubes called microtubular cells, which are in themselves quantum computers networked together in a coherent state where they all fire in synchrony. And the firing of synchrony of these quantum computers in the microtubules that make up the cells that make up my brain cells cause the brain cells themselves to go into a state of coherent synchronized firings with other neurons, which are a neuron external reflection of the synchronized firings of the quantum computers inside each of those neurons in the microtubules that also extend out the axons to the synapse. So not only is the neuron itself making decisions, we think of the neurons as the thinking part, and the axon as being wires that connect to other neurons. But no, the microtubules are showing us that the axon itself is part of the neuron, part of the decision-making structure of the neuron. The brain of the neuron extends outside the neuron cell into the axon with microtubules, and all those microtubules are in sync with each other in a coherent state of quantum wave production, spooky action at a distance, where now we see processes where what's happening at the synapse causes a state of quantum entanglement with other synapses throughout the whole system. And now brain neurons in various distant parts of the cortex are in instantaneous, outside of time communication and synchrony with each other across the whole cortex. And the brain is in sync with all other systems the same way. As all of us in this community that we're part of with these live streams, when we listen to headphones with the brain entrainment soundtrack, and the brain entrainment creates the clock that the neurons want to time themselves to achieve a certain brain state, and all of the neurons start to sync up with this external pulse, and everybody's listening to the same soundtrack. All of our brain waves are synchronizing up together at a distance and forming a massive brain neuron virtual network across the world, because I've got people here from all over the world. So it's not just the US that's listening to this, it's people all over the world that are listening to this. And so now we have a global networked brain that's cohered and synchronized up together through brain entrainment by listening to the same soundtrack simultaneously all at the same time. And once we do that, we synchronize up with the quantum field. And we synchronize up with a part of the quantum field where our expectation can shift the quantum field and make it different than what it is. Instead of being a random series of events, we're making the events. We're focusing an intention to change the world at a quantum level. So it's not the world we have, it's the world it could be. Our problem is to flesh out within ourselves, what does it look like? What does this world that could be look like? What is it we want to make this world to be if we had that power? So we have all the technology now to link our brainwaves together at a quantum field to change the quantum field. What do we want to change it to? That is our task, to figure out what is it? What is it? What is this world? What do we want it to be? So these networks of microtubules spread throughout each cell, spread throughout each microtubule, that's the scaffolding for all the cells, and the neurons and the cells in my body, it's all part of this giant network. This is a micrograph of microtubules right here. Actual microtubules through a microscope. Quantum computers inside the neuron. This is a microphotograph back here of microtubule connections inside a cell. This is what they look like. Except they're spiraled. It's a spiral connection. And here's these articles coming every month now. Discovery of quantum vibrations in microtubules inside brain neurons corroborates a controversial 20-year-old theory of consciousness. Now, this theory is talking about that since consciousness is associated with the speed of firings of the neurons in synchrony with each other, forming waves of depolarization, the speed of those waves of depolarization are directly related to different states of consciousness. Like I said, beta, alpha, theta, delta. But they're arising from quantum vibrations in the microtubules that populate each neuron. And so the neuron is being pushed to fire its depolarization from the microtubules, which are making quantum calculations in the field of all possible calculations of an outcome and directing the neuron to fire at a certain specific time. And they're all doing it in synchrony with each other through a coupled oscillator effect, which I think is the universal law behind spooky action at a distance. This idea of quantum entanglement, where once things connect together, they're forever linked, no matter how far apart they then become. They're always in sync with each other. Even if they're on the other side of the universe, they're in sync with each other outside of time. And now we're seeing that as a quantum effect in the brain. Brain neurons are in sync with each other no matter what distance they are from each other, simultaneously in the moment, outside of time. Is your brain really a computer, or is it a quantum orchestra? Could we be performing quantum computing in our own brain? Answer is yes. The phosphorus atoms in your body have the necessary nuclear spin that could act as biochemical qubits. A qubit, remember, is the, instead of a bit in a computer, 0 and 1, qubits is all possible zeros, ones, and maybes. Scientists are studying the nuclear spin and other dynamics of nanoclusters of spherically shaped Posner molecules, which could be performing a role of neuroqubits. Now, these Posner molecules I talked about last time, where phosphorus atoms in the body will link together and then become entangled, and then they will form other structures where they bind together in a Posner molecule. And the Posner molecule is formed inside of these phosphorus entangled networks. But these entangled networks are tangled up also with networks that they were previously in contact with before the Posner molecule was formed. So these phosphorus atoms will link up together with all kinds of other phosphorus atoms. They all get entangled together, and then they all separate out into different regions and form these Posner molecules. And the Posner molecules begin to migrate out to all kinds of different positions in the brain, and they're all entangled together, and they all have instantaneous communication with each other in a wireless network, a quantum wireless internet network of the brain. No time is involved in sending a signal from one to the other. It's true outside of time quantum simultaneity of an array of trillions of connections at the synapse that are all instantly communicating with each other and making quantum decisions of every possible outcome in a neural qubit, in a quantum computer. Wrap your mind around that one. New Scientist magazine, brain entanglement could explain memories. Subatomic particles do it. Now the observation that groups of brain cells seem to have their own version of quantum entanglement, or spooky action at a distance. This could help explain how our minds combine experiences from different senses into one memory. Previous experiments have shown that the electrical activity of neurons is in separate parts of the brain can oscillate simultaneously at the same frequency, a process known as phase locking. The frequency seems to be a signature that marks out neurons working on the same task, allowing them to identify with each other. We're talking about groups of neurons that are coupled oscillated together through the quantum process of entanglement. So for me, entanglement is coupled oscillators. It's just that coupled oscillators outside of time at a quantum effect explains to me entanglement, spooky action at a distance. And it's the same laws, this quantum fluctuations like that, this coherence of different things in different places that are synchronized up together through what looks like coupled oscillator networks. It's the same laws that govern music. It's the same laws that govern brain entrainment. Same laws that govern why the wine glass vibrates when I sing the right note. Sympathetic resonance. Discovery of quantum vibrations in microtubules inside brain neurons supports controversial theory of consciousness. Consciousness is deeply associated with the vibrations of these quantum microtubules as they link themselves up together outside of time in coherent states of rhythms that reflect themselves in the rhythms of brainwaves. And the speed of the rhythms of brainwaves are directly associated with different states of consciousness. So consciousness itself is a quantum effect, is synchronized up with a quantum field. But when we talk about, when you split the atom apart and split those pieces apart, smaller and smaller and smaller, split them apart, you finally end up at the bottom where there's nothing. There's nothing that can be measured with our instruments. We call it a vacuum. We know it's not a vacuum. It's a substance. It's too subtle to measure. And it's in a state of vibration forming standing waves. And the standing waves look like something, but it's an illusion. Standing wave looks solid, but it's not. It's dancing sand particles on the metal plate kind of a thing, forming a pattern. A pattern is an illusion. You get close enough to the pattern, it's just dancing sand particles. But from the ancient literature back to the Vedas, the substance at the core of the quantum field that's in a state of vibration is consciousness itself resonating and rippling an idea. And this is the idea. All of this is the idea in sort of the mind of God, so to speak. Progress in Physics magazine. Non-local effects of chemical substances on the brain produced through quantum entanglement. Chemical substances as we're talking previously about phosphorus, tryptophan, serotonin, melatonin, the 6 or 8 different neurotransmitters that have a possibility of transmitting a chemical signal across the synapse at each neural connection. Those are chemicals. And so what we're seeing is an interface between quantum resonance effects at a microtubular level and the creation of proteins that make chemical substances in the brain, particularly with the synapse and neurotransmitters. So we have this massive cellular network with all of these microtubules. This is a neuron. This is what's called the neuron, with all of its microtubular connections that are going out connecting to other neurons. All of it based on this that I covered in great detail in a past live stream, the law of coupled oscillators. You can look this article up and read it. It's dense because Scientific American tends to be dense reading. But it's mind-blowing stuff, what they're talking about here. This is the definitive article about biological synchronization and coupled oscillators, from networks in neurons in the brain to gates of walking and the universal laws of why everything wants to dance together to the same drum beat. This is the article that explains it all. Look it up. Do a Google search. Go to Scientific American. You can get this article. December 1993. Scientific American. Coupled oscillators and biological synchronization. It's the foundation of everything. This coupled oscillator phenomenon goes from the core of the quantum field to governing the relationship of distant supergalactic nebula that are also synchronized up spooky action at a distance. It's like a massive universally large brain, a brain network. This all ties together with what I talked about before, also with Cleve Baxter, the father of lie detection, and hooking up his lie detector machine to a plant leaf. Actually, he hooked up the galvanic skin detector, but in the process he damaged the leaf, and the plant had a response on the lie detector machine, a stress response. And then he realized that all he had to do is think about harming the plant after that, and it would have a stress response. Somehow there was a level of biocommunication at a distance where the plant was reading his intention of harm and having a response. It was not even physical anymore. This is a quantum effect. This is a coupled oscillator quantum effect, because now Cleve was quantum connected to the plant. They found out that this plant would have a series of stress responses during the day when he wasn't even there. And it turned out that when he was out in the world and would come up against a stressful situation, through the coupled oscillator effect, the plant would have a stress response as he's having a stress response, in sync with each other. That's spooky action at a distance in a biological systems. It's a macro effect in the macro world of a quantum effect of entanglement. And that generated, these books, The Secret Life of Plants, from that work with his plants, and his later work with cells, where he would take scrapings from the inside of your cheek, living cells, and harm those cells, and you'd have a response in another room hooked up to a lie detector test outside of time. More quantum entanglement of you and your body, mediated through these coupled oscillator networks, coupled quantized mechanical oscillators in the microtubule network. Mind-blowing stuff. Causing coupled oscillator effects. The same kind of thing we see in binaural beats that entrain your brainwaves. The same thing we see in coupled oscillator systems of singing the right note and the wine glass vibrates, or quantum particles on different parts of the universe are synchronized up together outside of time. Here's a pyramidal neuron in the motor cortex, the microtubules, the pathways that go through quantum fields. But look at this, the pi resonance oscillations within these quantum states of the things that make up the microtubule. Those oscillations are synchronized up with tubulin, which makes the microtubule, synced up to the microtubule itself, synchronized up to microtubules in general, bundles of microtubules, and influences the depolarization of neurons in your brain and makes brain waves. This is the link right here. All of these are synchronized up at nanoscales of frequencies. Synchronized up to your brain. And brain waves are associated with states of consciousness. All linked up through, what I talked about before. Posner clusters in phosphorus atoms of the brain, linked with the synapse, pushing quantum states that are associated with quantum computing at a synapse level. Discovery of quantum vibrations in microtubules inside brain neurons corroborates the 20-year theory of consciousness again. The coherence of the firing of the microtubules affecting the firing of brain waves. Spooky action at a distance. Non-local effects of chemical substances in the brain produced through quantum entanglement. The DNA helix structure is due to entanglement of co-vibrating structures within the DNA, which are formed with microtubules, which are formed from the piezo action at a distance, even in the formation of DNA strands. These DNA, they fold up, and they fold up in different configurations, which affects their function. So there's this whole other dimension of DNA. It's not just this double helix strand, but it curls up on itself in different forms, different physical shapes, which changes how it functions. And this protein folding is what it's called, is a quantum event based on tunneling and resonance of microtubules. It's confirmation. So I'll read this because it's too small. What are microtubules? In the standard model of brain functioning, consciousness arises through 100 billion single-celled organisms known as neurons, transmitting electrochemical signals to each other. Neurotransmitters at the synapse. In Hameroff and Penrose's model, famous neurologists, neuronal connections are only part of the story. Within each neuron, there are hundreds of tiny cylindrical polymers called microtubules. Zooming in on a single microtubule, one sees millions of protein subunits called tubulin, arranged in complex molecular lattices. Remember, these all have piezoelectric effects. Every nanosecond, tubulin proteins can flex between two different shapes, open or closed, driven by quantum mechanized processes. Within a single neuron, the combined microtubule activity equals potentially 1,000 trillion operations per second in computing power. Consciousness arises through these countless quantum computational amplifying or magnifying the latent field of conscious awareness embedded in the fabric of space-time itself. That the quantum resonances at a quantum field that affect the quantum structure of the atoms that make up microtubules are reflected in the coherent resonances of microtubules reflected in the neurons and the axons of the brain cells, which are linked to each other through the synapse, which also has quantum effects through these 6 different neurotransmitter molecules, all in synchronized couple oscillator connections with one another that form couple oscillator resonant waves of depolarization across the cortex, which we call brain waves, and the speed of those brain waves equals different states of consciousness. And DNA itself begins as a quantum wave. Quantum waves interacting. This is pretty much what binaural beats look like. This little green balloon, he's got another green balloon over here, and he's tapping them on the water, creating these waves that come out. And the interference pattern of the 2 waves of the 2 balls are crossing over each other and creating these interference patterns of standing waves. It's mind-blowing what's going on in this brain, how it networks out into the whole universe, and how we network our brains together through this coupled oscillator network of different people's brains resonating at exactly the same brain entrainment frequency that's forcing a certain speed of depolarization in my brain that's equaling a very highly specific state of consciousness, which is what our mind links are doing when we put headphones on. A coupled oscillator network of many minds, many neurons, many microtubules, all the way down to a quantum effect level, where we can change reality itself if we can get a handle on what we want it to be. The magic of the universe inside every neuron of your brain, and every cell of each neuron, and every microtubule of, and every synapse, all of it is linked up together in a massive network of quantum processes that has direct effect in this macro world. And with that being said, we are going to go on a deep journey into that quantum field by resonating everybody's brainwaves together. And in this case, we're back to the exploration of the deep fields of entrainment that we're currently doing as experimental in iota brain activity, the super extreme slow brain activity that is even slower than the default mode network, which I've spent a lot of time fleshing out in past broadcasts. It's the resonant field that other life forms on a planet synchronize to, plant life forms in particular, trees and bushes and little green things. So with that, this soundtrack, by the way, is the previous, is portion of the previous soundtrack that we listened to last time that had particular power to center. So I took that section and I developed just that one section, expanded it out. So this gets deeper and deeper and deeper as we go. So fasten your seatbelt and close your eyes, and here we go. Here's where you can get the soundtrack and download it today. These soundtracks last for 1 week, and then they're replaced with the next one. So make sure you grab it and store it someplace on your computer. Sitting and meditating with this is the way to use it. Thank you all very much. Stay safe, be happy and healthy and holy, and I will see you again next Sunday.